Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to take on those big, complex, sometimes jargon-filled topics and really distill them down.
Right, to get to the essential knowledge, the things you really need to know to be truly informed.
And today we are tackling a big one. It's one of the most, I think, polarizing and pervasive terms in modern global affairs: neoliberalism.
It's a word you hear literally everywhere. I mean, in political debates, economic critiques, historical analysis, but it's used so broadly.
It just becomes a catch-all, right?
Absolutely.
Either an insult or this vague statement of principle.
And it loses all its specific meaning in the process.
Yeah.
So our sources for this deep dive are, well, they're an authoritative stack of texts that really trace its origins, its core ideas, and, the actual mechanics of how it was put into practice.
So our mission for you is to really unpack this doctrine, the one that became, you could argue it became the single guiding principle of economic thought and management across the globe after the 1970s. We're going to try and move beyond the rhetoric, the slogans, to see the actual practices, and this is crucial, the underlying motivations.
And how it happened. What was, let's be honest, a fringe academic minority opinion?
Oh, absolutely. A very fringe idea.
How did that become the dominant economic configuration that we often just call globalization today?
And that transformation, of course, it wasn't some kind of accident. It wasn't just an evolution.
No, not at all. The sources are really clear on this. It was the result of a protracted and intentional struggle. And it was waged by specific, really pivotal figures.
So who are these agents of change, the people who took this theory and made it a global practice?
Well, you have to start with the powerful U.S. Federal Reserve Chairman, Paul Volcker. Then you have the political tandem of Ronald Reagan in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in Britain.
The famous duo.
Exactly. And perhaps paradoxically, you even see figures like Deng Xiaoping in China, whose market reforms happen to coincide right with this Western turn.
Okay, so let's unpack the core structure here. Because when you look at the entire sweep of this thing, of neoliberalization, the sources introduce a central tension that really dictates how we have to interpret everything that follows.
Right. There are two fundamentally different ways to look at this project.
What's the first one?
The first interpretation is the one you usually hear articulated publicly. It's neoliberalization as a kind of utopian project.
Utopian in what sense?
The idea that it was designed to realize a theoretical ideal, free markets, efficient allocation of resources, minimal state intrusion.
And ultimately maximizing individual freedom and dignity for everyone. That's the aspirational rhetoric.
That's a sales pitch.
And then there's the second interpretation, the one that our sources suggest has really dominated in practice. And it's a lot more cynical.
It's much more eliminating, I think. The second interpretation frames it as an explicit political project.
Okay, a political project with what goal?
Its true functional objective, according to this view, was to reestablish the conditions for capital accumulation and, most critically, to restore the power and political dominance of economic elites.
So the corporate and financial classes.
The very people who felt fundamentally threatened by that whole post-war social contract. And the utopian rhetoric, the talk of freedom and dignity. The sources argue that was highly effective, but it was primarily a tool.
A tool for what?
A system of justification. A way to legitimize policies that were really designed to achieve that one singular goal. Restoring elite power. This idea, this class-based restoration, that's the key thread we need to follow through this entire deep dive.
So to really get the scope of that struggle, we have to understand the system that neoliberalism had to dismantle first?
Yes, exactly. You have to understand the post-WWII structure, which is often called embedded liberalism.
And this wasn't just a random set of policies.
Not at all. It was a structure that was painstakingly built, really, to prevent a return to the catastrophic political and economic conditions of the 1930s, the Great Slump, the war that followed.
It sounds like a consensus built on shared trauma. So what were the specific terms of this compromise that held sway across, the advanced industrialized nations from the late 40s through the 60s?
It was, at its heart, a fundamental class compromise. Capital, on the one hand, accepted certain constraints on its mobility and its profitability.
And in return for what?
In return for social peace and a thriving, stable consumer base. And the state's role was defined as active and vital. Crucially, the consensus was that the state had to focus on three big things: maintaining full employment, ensuring steady economic growth and building out comprehensive welfare systems for citizens
How did they do that?
by actively using Keynesian fiscal and monetary policies, so adjusting government spending, taxation, that kind of thing, to soften business cycles and manage demand.
So the domestic economy was highly managed, but what about the international structure? Because that's where the power of global finance was deliberately, kept in check.
And that's where the architecture of Bretton Woods comes in.
Hmm.
It was established in 1944, and it provided stability by setting up fixed exchange rates, all anchored by the U.S. dollar's convertibility into gold.
You also had the creation of the IMF and the World Bank.
Right, to manage stability and development. But the cornerstone, really, the thing designed to prevent the chaos of the 1930s, was the requirement for, and the implementation of, controls on the free mobility of capital.
Controls over capital mobility.
Yeah.
That feels like the absolute key here. Our sources use the term financial repression to describe that condition.
Yes, and financial repression sounds bad, but it isn't repression of people. It's the repression of finance capital's power.
How so?
By imposing cross-border controls and often setting interest rates low, sometimes even below the rate of inflation, governments essentially prevented domestic capital from just fleeing to other markets whenever it wanted.
It forced capital to stay put, to stay domestic.
Exactly. And there, it was channeled into national development projects or, importantly, into purchasing government debt at favorable rates, which is what supported that huge expansion of the welfare state. And the system of control, it allowed for a pretty phenomenal result. For
Because it
example,
was high growth, the building of the welfare state, and critically strong working class power.
for sure. The 1950s and 60s were, for many advanced capitalist nations, a kind of golden age. You had high rates of economic growth, a massive expansion of public spending, and really robust trade union power, which was, internalized and mediated by the state through collective bargaining.
It created a lot of stability,
It did. But we have to pause and acknowledge a really vital caveat in the source material here.
which is
For much of the developing world, particularly in Africa and parts of Latin America, the promise of embedded liberalism, it remained a distant, unfulfilled dream. They were often trapped by colonial legacies and excluded from the benefits of this stable international trade system.
And that successful, if geographically uneven era, it all came crashing down in the 1970s. So why? Why did this system, which seemed so stable for 20 years, suddenly just unravel?
It faced a fundamental simultaneous dual crisis. It was both political and economic.
Let's start with the economic side.
On the economic side, corporate profitability was declining precipitously. The rate of capital accumulation was stalling out.
Why was it stalling?
It was a mix of things. You had global factors like the oil shocks, but also domestic factors like strong, empowered labor that was constantly pushing for higher wages and benefits, which, from capital's perspective, squeezed their profit margins.
So the class compromise was starting to fray because capital felt it was losing too much ground to labor. And this combined with the famous stagflation.
Right, stagflation. That toxic combination of high inflation coupled with economic stagnation and rising unemployment, it was the symptom that just horrified economists at the time.
The sources give the UK as a powerful example.
A perfect example. By 1975, inflation in the UK had surged to an astronomical 26%. Unemployment topped 1 million, and the nationalized industries, which were supposed to be the pride of the nation, were now seen as these colossal drains on the public purse. The state's ability to manage the economy just seemed to have vanished.
And in the US, the political reality was basically the same. Intense class struggle, you see it in the strike data, and falling profitability for non-financial corporations. This was the environment where capital decided it needed a radical new doctrine to reset the balance of power.
It was a palpable shift. And the ultimate political breaking point came when the institutions of the state, even those run by, social democratic parties, were forced to turn against their own traditional working class supporters.
You're talking about the UK Labour government, right, in 75, 76.
Exactly. They were facing fiscal difficulties, a balance of payments crisis, and they were forced to turn to the International Monetary Fund.
And the IMF didn't just offer a helping hand. They offered, a whole new economic constitution?
That's a great way to put it. The IMF intervention forced the Labour government to accept immediate, draconian budgetary cutbacks in welfare spending, in public employment.
That's a huge moment.
It was a moment of profound significance. You had the state, under duress from international financial institutions, being compelled to impose deeply anti-labor austerity policies. This act effectively signaled the end of the embedded liberalism consensus. The state could no longer mediate the class compromise. Instead, it was overtly siding with financial integrity over the welfare of its citizens. The political ground was now, fertile for the radical doctrines of neoliberalism to be planted.
And it's so important to remember that a massive shift like this in the economic structure, it can't be sold to the public as a plan to restore elite power.
No, of course not.
It has to be wrapped in something compelling, a universal ideal. And neoliberalism, well, it successfully leveraged the most potent ideal available.
Absolutely. The utopian rhetoric was all about dignity and individual freedom. Our sources really highlight its broad appeal. I mean, it spoke to dissidents who were yearning for self-determination in Eastern Europe and the Soviet bloc.
It spoke to the students in Tiananmen Square.
To students in Tiananmen Square, and to anti-authoritarian student movements globally. It made this connection between economic deregulation and fundamental human rights, which created an incredibly potent psychological package.
The power of that language is just undeniable. It's why President Bush framed the post-9/11 U.S. global mission in such lofty terms, right? Claiming the U.S. had this obligation to lead the spread of liberty.
But the 19th century cultural critic Matthew Arnold, he provides the perfect challenge here. He observed that freedom is a very good horse to ride, but to ride somewhere.
Which forces you to ask the question.
Where was this new freedom actually headed? When you strip away all the rhetoric and you look at the implementation, the destination reveals the true objective. And I don't think any case study is starker or more immediate than post-war Iraq in 2003.
Right. After the initial justifications for the preemptive war, failed to hold water, the Bush administration pivoted. They started claiming they were conferring freedom upon the Iraqis.
Yes. And the specific form that freedom took was the complete instant imposition of a radical neoliberal economy.
And the mechanism for this was Paul Bremer, the head of the Coalition Provisional Authority.
It was. Within months of the invasion, he promulgated 4 specific orders that just amounted to an entire economic overhaul imposed by an unelected foreign administrator.
Okay, can you give us the specifics of those 4 orders? Because they are incredibly revealing about this neoliberal destination.
They really are. So first, full privatization of public enterprises, selling off state assets. Second, full foreign ownership rights of Iraqi businesses, allowing 100% foreign control.
So no local partner required.
Not at all. Third, full and immediate repatriation of foreign profits, meaning investors could pull all their money out instantly, whatever they wanted. And fourth, the wholesale elimination of nearly all trade barriers and tariffs.
Wow. And this applied to everything.
This applied to virtually every sector, finance, manufacturing. The only temporary exception was the massive oil sector, which was likely excluded just because of its strategic and immediate revenue significance.
That is the ultimate realization of the theoretical neoliberal ideal state. A completely unregulated market where capital is just its king.
It is.
But what about the freedom of the workers in this newly free nation?
And that is the crucial, devastating contrast that exposes the political objective. While capital markets were utterly liberalized, the labor market was strictly controlled.
How is it controlled?
Bremer's orders effectively forbade strikes in key sectors, and they severely restricted the right to unionize and organize labor. And on top of that, they imposed a highly regressive flat tax, a kind of conservative fantasy, which disproportionately benefits the wealthy and reduces the public services available to the poor.
So the state was stripped of its ability to manage the economy, but it kept immense power to repress labor.
That's it. The sources are clear that Bremer's hope was to create these institutional arrangements that were so entrenched they would take on a life and momentum of their own and become extremely difficult for any future democratically elected Iraqi government to reverse.
It just confirms that the destination of this horse of freedom wasn't democratic self-determination at all.
No, it was the imposition of what the London economists celebrated at the time as a capitalist dream regime. The goal was to cement the dominance of foreign capital and a compliant local elite, completely regardless of the democratic wishes of the Iraqi population. It perfectly aligns with that argument that the utopian rhetoric is just a justification for a political project of restoring and maximizing elite power.
Which brings us back to the theory of the ideal neoliberal state. If the state is supposed to be minimal, what's left of its function? What does it actually do?
In theory, the state's role is stripped down to just a few core functions. It's supposed to guarantee the sanctity of contracts, ensure private property rights, and guarantee the integrity and stability of money. That's about it.
And the emphasis shifts entirely to the individual.
Completely. Personal success or failure gets interpreted solely in terms of, entrepreneurial virtues or personal failings.
Mm.
You succeed because you wisely invested in your own human capital
Yeah.
through education. You fail because you were somehow deficient. And this becomes the rationale for eliminating state-led welfare.
But that whole theoretical framework, it relies on a fundamentally utopian and really an unsupported premise.
It does. It relies on the presumption of perfect information and a perfectly level playing field for competition. But in the real world, better informed and already more powerful players, the ones who possess large amounts of capital, they have an immediate, immense advantage.
And they can use that advantage to get even more power.
Of course, they can easily parlay that advantage into procuring even better information and greater relative power. So these asymmetric power relations, they don't just dissipate, they intensify. And that leads inevitably to the concentration of wealth and, critically, the restoration of class power.
Which leads to the ultimate practical contradiction of the neoliberal state.
Yeah.
It's supposed to step back and let the market decide.
Right.
Yet it has to be fiercely active to defend the capitalist order from any kind of democratic challenge.
Exactly. The pursuit of free markets often requires intense and often non-democratic state intervention by unelected elites, the Federal Reserve, the IMF, or military administrators like Bremer. They have to protect those property rights. They have to guard against collective choice.
They have to prevent people from forming strong unions or passing environmental protection.
Or voting for anti-market political parties. So the state must be minimalist in providing welfare, but maximally aggressive in enforcing the rules of capitalism.
And that concept of a fiercely aggressive yet minimal state intervention brings us directly to the critical inflection point in the U.S. The moment this, academic theory became a brutally efficient practice, the Volcker shock.
To set the scene for that, we have to go back to the great inflation of the 1970s. And while there were external shocks, like the oil price hikes, the domestic sources point back to political maneuvering.
Arthur Burns, the Fed chair in the early 70s.
Yep. He notoriously kept interest rates artificially low to help President Nixon's 1972 re-election effort. And this, in an economy already near full employment, was like throwing gasoline on a fire.
And once that inflationary spiral began, it just fed on itself. It surged from, 3.2% in 1972 to over 11% by 1975, and eventually peaked at over 13% in 1980.
And that runaway inflation, it was more than just an economic nuisance. It was socially destabilizing. It randomly redistributed gains and losses. It penalized people on fixed incomes. It threw all saving and spending plans into complete disarray.
It's just created this profound sense of uncertainty.
Right. It made the economy ragged and inefficient. And the corporate and financial sectors, seeing their profits squeezed by rising labor costs and struggling to plan because of these volatile prices, they were demanding a solution.
Which led President Carter to appoint Paul Volcker as Fed chairman in August of 1979. And Volcker wasn't some establishment moderate. He was known for his uncompromising anti-inflationary zeal.
Volcker's appointment was explicitly political. Stuart Eisenstadt, who was Carter's domestic policy advisor, later recalled that Volcker was chosen because he was the candidate of Wall Street. This was their price.
So his selection was a clear signal.
A crystal clear signal that the grievances of the financial sector about inflation would be addressed no matter what the consequences were for the rest of the economy.
And 2 months later, October 1979, Volcker enacts a revolution in monetary policy that fundamentally changes the cost of money, not just in the U.S., but globally.
It was a shocking draconian shift. Volcker formally abandoned the long-standing post-war commitment to full employment, that core pillar of embedded liberalism, in favor of a single obsessive policy objective.
Eradicating inflation.
Eradicating inflation, no matter the cost in jobs or production. Technically, what he did was shift the Fed's policy from targeting the Fed funds interest rate to targeting the growth of the money supply, specifically the non-borrowed reserves held by banks.
What was the practical consequence of that, of targeting the money supply instead of the interest rate?
Well, by focusing on reserves, the Fed basically sent a signal to the banks that they were cutting off the flow of cheap money and were, frankly, indifferent to the interest rates that would result from that. This sudden scarcity of money in the system caused interest rates to just skyrocket, sometimes by several hundred basis points in a single day.
So the real rate of interest, which had often been negative during the inflationary 70s,
was now rendered sharply and dramatically positive by fiat of the Federal Reserve.
and those nominal rates, they went through the roof. They were close to 20% by July of 1981. This was the Volcker shock. a deliberate, sharp intervention to prove to the markets that the Fed was serious.
It was a policy designed to inflict pain. When Volcker met with senior editors of the Wall Street Journal right after the shift, he famously asked them if they would still support him when there's blood all over the floor.
Wow.
He knew this policy was guaranteed to create immense economic pain, widespread business failures, massive unemployment. But he believed that pain was necessary to break the back of inflation and, critically, the power of labor.
And the economic devastation that followed, it really validates his prediction. The U.S. suffered two sharp recessions in quick succession.
Right, which drove unemployment to 10.8% by the end of 1982. That was the highest level since 1940. And this economic dislocation, this pain, it created the necessary environment for the political dimension of this class war to unfold.
The massive pool of unemployed workers, what classical economists call the Industrial Reserve Army, that served as the cover.
It served as the cover. But the explicit political assault was delivered by the newly elected Ronald Reagan, who provided the crucial political signal to corporations that the rules had changed permanently.
And we're talking about Reagan facing down the Air Traffic Controllers Union, PATI-CO, in 1981. Why was that particular moment so symbolic?
PATI-CO was so critical because it wasn't a traditional blue-collar union of, say, factory workers. It was a union of white-collar, highly skilled professional workers.
Right.
By firing all 11,000 striking controllers and decertifying the union, Reagan signaled an unprecedented full frontal assault on organized labor. He was effectively telling corporate America, we will use the power of the state to break unions, and we will tolerate your use of replacement workers.
So Volcker's policy created the economic precondition, the fear of unemployment, and Reagan provided the political endorsement for capitalists to use that fear aggressively.
That's it, exactly. Volcker himself later credited the breaking of PATI-CO as the most important contribution of the Reagan administration in the fight against inflation. Not because of its direct economic effect, but because it permanently broke the morale and the bargaining power of organized labor across the entire economy.
And the data just shows the devastating effectiveness of this two-pronged attack. The long decline in real wage levels began in earnest, even as worker productivity continued to climb.
Our material highlights that divergence starkly. You look at the federal minimum wage. In 1980, it stood on a par with the poverty level. By 1990, it had plummeted to 30% below that level.
That's incredible.
It confirms a primary political objective. The policies implemented by Volcker and Reagan were a coordinated class war from above. They strategically undermined labor power and permitted a massive redistribution of wealth and income toward capital and away from wages. It was highly effective in restoring elite power, even if it took years for global growth to truly stabilize.
The Volcker shock didn't just decimate labor power, though. It also fundamentally redirected the flow of capital itself.
It did. Those high interest rates meant that capital moved dramatically away from traditional fixed assets, factories, machinery, productive investment, and into financial assets, stocks, bonds, real estate speculation.
This is the era of financialization, the core structural shift of neoliberalism.
And deregulation systematically dismantled the constraints of that old embedded liberalism regime. This freed finance to innovate, or, as critics would say, to speculate through all these complex new instruments like securitization and derivatives.
In corporations themselves, their whole identity changed. They became less focused on, making widgets or producing services and more focused on financial maneuvering.
Correct. The sources describe corporations as becoming more and more financial in their orientation. They began treating their own financial balance sheets as their primary profit centers. They'd often offset losses in their core production with immense gains from purely financial operations, like credit issuance or insurance or sophisticated speculation.
And this cemented a colossal power shift.
A huge one. The shift was away from production and toward finance. I mean, if the old embedded liberal consensus was what is good for General Motors is good for the U.S.
The new consensus, forged in the 1980s, became what is good for Wall Street is all that matters.
And that power shift meant the entire state apparatus, led by the G7 countries, was now structurally obligated to prioritize the support and the integrity of the financial system, the bankers, the traders, the institutional investors, over almost everything else.
Including the well-being of the population or the stability of industrial employment.
Exactly. But before this became national or global policy, our sources point to one powerful domestic case study that provided the literal blueprint for what would become structural adjustment.
The New York City fiscal crisis of 1975.
This was the pivotal demonstration that financial integrity trumps democracy, and it happened right in the financial heart of America. New York City, suffering from industrial decline, years of profligate borrowing, suddenly found itself facing a budget crisis.
And a powerful cabal of investment bankers led by Walter Wriston of Citibank seized the moment.
They did. They refused to roll over the city's short-term debt, which effectively pushed the city into technical bankruptcy and triggered a financial panic.
This sounds exactly like the scenario that would later play out in dozens of developing nations across the globe. What was the solution that was imposed on NYC?
Well, the city's democratic governance was essentially suspended. New, non-elected institutions, the Emergency Financial Control Board and the Municipal Assistance Corporation, they took over budget management.
And their authority.
Their authority mandated that bondholders received first claim on all city tax revenues, prioritizing finance over essential public services. The city was forced into a severe internal structural adjustment program.
What did that adjustment look like for the citizens, for the public sector?
Oh, it was punitive. It involved curbing the power of the municipal unions, imposing strict wage freezes, cutting public employment drastically, and it implemented sweeping cutbacks in essential services.
Most famously, this is when CUNY, the City University of New York, was forced to impose tuition for the first time.
Right. It had long provided free education. And then in a final, really cynical move, the city required its own municipal unions to invest their pension funds heavily in city bonds.
Forcing them to moderate their future demands or risk the total loss of their retirement security.
You got it. The source material describes this whole event as a coup by the financial institutions against the democratically elected government of New York City.
It's hard to argue with that description.
It was a brutal lesson. It resulted in a massive, regressive redistribution of wealth and resources toward the upper classes and financial creditors. And the journalist Thomas Edsall, he correctly concluded that the politics of the subsequent Reagan administration became merely the New York scenario of the 1970s writ large. The template was set. Financial crises are opportunities for wealth concentration and for dismantling the social contract.
And we can't forget that this internal financial coup, it was backed by a long-term coordinated political mobilization by the capitalist class itself, which actually preceded Volcker and Reagan.
This is such a crucial piece of context. The mobilization really dates back to 1971, when Lewis Powell, who would later become a Supreme Court justice, sent a confidential memorandum to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce.
The Powell Memo.
The Powell Memo. And Powell argued that the free enterprise system was under aggressive assault from academics, media, activist groups. And his solution was a corporate call to arms.
What was the objective?
Powell called for marshaling the wisdom, ingenuity, and resources of American business to aggressively assault and shift public thinking by capturing key institutions, universities, the media, and crucially, the courts. This was not disorganized lobbying. This was an explicit call for systematic, class-conscious political spending.
And this led directly to the formation of these powerful cross-industry coalitions.
Yes. Organizations like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the Business Roundtable, founded in '72, they amassed these immense, unprecedented campaign chests for lobbying. They worked across industry lines, systematically funding and leaning toward right-wing political candidates.
And they poured money into conservative think tanks.
A ton of money. Into places like the Heritage Foundation, the Hoover Institute, and even prestigious economic research bodies like the National Bureau of Economic Research, the NBER, where nearly half of its financing came from Fortune 500 companies.
So business learned to spend as a class. They effectively captured the Republican Party as their political instrument and provided all the necessary organizational and ideological infrastructure for the Volcker-Reagan revolution to take root.
And this class dominance was then legally cemented. Starting in 1976, landmark Supreme Court decisions established that the right of a corporation to make unlimited money contributions to political parties was protected under the First Amendment guarantee of freedom of speech,
which legalized the financial corruption of politics?
And cemented the class dominance of corporate interests. It made the restoration of elite power both economically possible and politically mandated.
So the high interest rates that Volcker imposed in 79-81, they didn't just cause a domestic recession. They immediately exported that economic pain around the world, especially to the developing world.
Right. And this is where the New York template became the global model.
How did that happen?
Well, the rapid rise in U.S. interest rates, from single digits to nearly 20%, it created a catastrophe for vulnerable developing countries. These nations had borrowed heavily in U.S. dollars during the 70s when rates were low. When Volcker raised the rates, their debt service obligations just skyrocketed overnight,
which pushed them into default.
easily pushed them into default. And the first major test case for this was Mexico in 1982.
Mexico's default, that presented an existential crisis for the New York investment banks that were holding all that debt. So the solution, invented by the U.S. Treasury and the IMF, it defined global policy for the next 30 years.
The birth of structural adjustment. And it's crucial to know that before 1982, the IMF underwent what the sources call a deliberate purge of any remaining Keynesian or developmental influences.
So the institution was strategically transformed.
It was transformed into the center for propagating and enforcing free market fundamentalism. So the U.S. Treasury and the IMF, they resolved the Mexican difficulty by rolling over the debt, but only on the explicit condition that Mexico implement radical neoliberal reforms.
So, if you were an indebted nation, the IMF and the World Bank offered you the medicine, a specific policy cocktail in exchange for rescheduling your debt.
And that cocktail was structural adjustment. It demanded draconian cuts in social welfare spending, the implementation of highly flexible labor market laws, which means weakened unions and lower real wages, and the wholesale privatization of state assets.
And this established the key difference in neoliberal debt practice.
It did.
Which is the fundamental shifting of risk. I mean, previously, lenders were expected to absorb some of the loss from a bad investment. Now, the burden fell entirely on the debtor nation.
Precisely. Under structural adjustment, the borrowers, often impoverished nations, were forced by international powers to take on the entire cost of debt repayment, regardless of the consequences for their national standard of living. This meant systematically extracting surpluses from already impoverished populations to pay back international bankers.
Critics at the time wryly noted that this resulted in the poor countries, in effect, subsidizing the richest.
Which is a perfect, brutal mechanism for global wealth redistribution, upward.
And the effects of this policy in Mexico after 1982 were devastating and immediate.
Oh, absolutely. Mexico was forced to join GATT, the precursor to the WTO, and implement continuous austerity programs. From 1983 to 1988, per capita income fell at a staggering rate of 5% per year.
5% per year.
And real wages plummeted by 40 to 50%. The inflation that structural adjustment was supposed to quell, it soared past 100% in certain years. The social contract was just shredded.
And this set the stage for NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which formalized the neoliberal dismantling of the entire productive economy.
Right. With NAFTA, the Salinas government accelerated privatization and, most controversially, attacked the very foundation of the Mexican peasant sector. They reformed the 1917 Constitution's ejido system.
And the ejidos were these collective landholding.
They were. They were designed to protect small farmers and subsistence agriculture. By reforming the system to permit privatization and foreign ownership, and then combining that with being swamped by cheap, subsidized U.S. agricultural imports, millions of peasants were just forced off their land.
Which simultaneously dismantled rural stability and
augmented the massive pool of the urban unemployed, which of course kept wages low for foreign manufacturing interests.
Then in 1995, we get the tequila crisis, which just confirmed where the real power resided.
Another U.S. Federal Reserve rate hike sparked that crisis, forcing a massive devaluation of the peso. Mexico couldn't pay its dollar-denominated debt. Now, while the U.S. Congress refused to give formal aid, President Clinton used his executive powers to authorize a colossal $47.5 billion rescue package.
And this wasn't just to protect U.S. jobs.
No, it was primarily to protect the legitimacy and the integrity of the newly implemented NAFTA agreements themselves. And the outcome was that U.S. capital rushed in to buy up Mexican assets, particularly banks, at fire sale prices.
And by 2000?
By 2000, 24 out of 30 major Mexican banks were foreign-owned. This resulted in what the sources call the exaction of tribute for Mexico's surpluses, being systematically extracted from the nation by international finance.
It's an important pivot now to the most, I think, paradoxical case of global market reform, one that seemed to run parallel to the Volcker-Reagan turn but operated under a completely different political logic. China under Deng Xiaoping.
Right. Deng's program began in December of 1978. And China also adopted market mechanisms, but critically, it maintained an authoritarian, centralized control system.
So unlike the Western model, which dismantled the state to empower capital,
China's state apparatus actively prevented the formation of a coherent, politically powerful capitalist class within China itself. They relied heavily on foreign direct investment (FDI), which effectively kept capitalist ownership offshore and therefore politically constrained.
And this allowed the state to leverage its massive labor surplus for competitive advantage, often at immense human cost.
Absolutely. The state created this surplus through centralized policy. Between 1998 and 2002 alone, 27 million workers were laid off from state-owned enterprises, SOEs,
27 million.
which created an enormous, desperately competing labor force. And this gave China an unparalleled competitive advantage globally. Hourly wages in Chinese textile production in the late 1990s were just 30 cents, compared to Mexico's structural adjustment-driven wage of $2.75.
But the Chinese production strategy itself was unique. It kind of reversed the typical logic of advanced capitalism.
It did. Highly productive plants in the U.S., they rely on expensive, advanced automation. Chinese factories, however, deliberately reversed this trend. They took capital out of the production process and reintroduced a greater role for labor.
And that dramatic reduction in required capital, combined with the extremely low wages,
Resulted in a stunning paradox.
yeah.
Chinese factories generated a higher return on capital than their counterparts in the U.S.
And this is where China fundamentally departs from strict neoliberal orthodoxy. Despite adopting flexible labor policies, welcoming foreign capital, the state retained immense power.
The Chinese state acted like a classic old-school Keynesian state when it needed to. To maintain social and political stability, which is essential after you generate such a large labor surplus, the government debt-financed these massive infrastructural and fixed capital formation projects.
On a huge scale.
A massive scale. Fixed capital investment increased by an astonishing 25% in 2003 alone. And this ability to debt finance, it required maintaining strict capital and exchange rate controls, an intervention that is utterly anathema to the free market fundamentalism imposed by the IMF on Mexico and other developing nations.
So China's example confirms that the state has to be strong to manage capitalism.
But it demonstrates that a powerful, non-democratic state can manage marketization without necessarily surrendering all its authority to a domestic capitalist elite.
So this uneven, politically motivated application of neoliberalization, combined with the inherent tension between its utopian aims and its practical outcome.
Of restoring class power.
Right. It means the neoliberal state is fundamentally an unstable political form. It relies on a perpetual contradiction.
A perpetual contradiction. Let's elaborate on those core contradictions that are identified in the source material. The first one really concerns the state's dual identity.
How so?
The state is crapped. On one hand, it's expected to take a hands-off, minimal role so markets can flourish. But on the other hand, it must be fiercely activist in creating a good business climate and behaving as a competitive corporate entity on the global stage, attracting capital and investment.
And that latter role, it demands national loyalty, sometimes aggressive nationalism.
Which is profoundly antagonistic to the core neoliberal agenda of seamless global free markets and free trade. We saw Thatcher using the Falklands War and anti-European sentiment to gain political cover for intensely anti-labor domestic neoliberal reforms.
And the second contradiction deals with the concept of competition itself, the advertised virtue of the whole system.
The system celebrates competition as a virtue. It promises endless consumer choice, efficiency. However, the reality of deregulation and financialization is the increasing systematic consolidation of oligopolistic and transnational monopoly power.
The sources cite a lot of examples.
They do. The soft drinks market being reduced to just Coke versus Pepsi, or various industries being dominated by a tiny handful of massive transnational corporations. The rhetoric of competition just masks the reality of wealth and power concentration.
And this concentration is maybe nowhere more visible than in the world of financialization, which morphed from an engine for efficient capital allocation into this vast system for rapid wealth redistribution.
The speculative and predatory style of financialization just accelerated dramatically after 1980, fueled by deregulation. Just consider the raw numbers. The total daily turnover of financial transactions in international markets soared from $2.3 billion in 1983 to a stunning $130 billion by 2001.
And you compare that $130 billion daily volume to what would actually be needed to support legitimate international trade,
which is estimated at about $800 million. So you see this enormous speculative surplus.
And that vast excess of money flowing through the financial system, that became the main center of wealth redistribution, focused not on production but on extraction.
Exactly. Deregulation allowed this system to flourish through speculation, fraud, and systematic asset stripping via mergers and acquisitions. And most painfully, It facilitated driving whole populations, both domestically and internationally, into debt peonage, where they are perpetually indebted to the financial sector. This introduced accelerating volatility and instability into global exchange relations.
And the most cynical aspect, I think, which reflects the lessons learned in New York City back in 1975, is how financial crises themselves are managed and manipulated to redistribute assets.
Crisis creation is an integral part of the system. The classic illustration is the 1997-98 Asian crisis. The combination of massive currency devaluations and IMF-pushed financial liberalization, it forced the sale of domestic assets at rock-bottom prices.
And this facilitated what was called the biggest peacetime transfer of assets from domestic to foreign owners in the past 50 years.
This is the brutal, real-world application of the concept attributed to Andrew Mellon, who reportedly said, in a depression, assets return to their rightful owners.
Yeah.
Financial integrity always trumps democracy and citizen well-being.
So if we look at the United States today, the core state of neoliberalism, despite its global power, it seems deeply unstable. Our sources point out that the U.S. is scoring high on all the indicators that would require an IMF intervention anywhere else.
For sure. Post-2004, the U.S. has demonstrated soaring budget deficits, a continuous balance of payments crisis, currency depreciation risks, and stagnant real wages for the majority of the population. This entire fiscal and financial situation would demand severe structural adjustment if it were, say, Mexico or Thailand.
But because of U.S. dominance of the IMF and the global financial structure, self-discipline is politically unlikely.
Right. The U.S. is borrowing from abroad at a rate approaching $2 billion a day.
And yet many in the U.S. elite seem strikingly untroubled by the prospect of a financial crash or a fiscal crisis. That suggests they view crisis as an opportunity.
Well, the ruling elite may calculate that they can survive a financial crash in good shape. They hold the financial assets, after all, and then use the crisis to complete their agenda of total domestic domination.
How would they do that?
They could use the emergency as justification for what is called confiscatory deflation, the final, total dismantling of public programs and pension rights, the last remaining pieces of the old social contract, using the emergency of the financial crisis as their political cover, just as was done in New York City in 1975.
So this leads us to the contemporary political opposition to this structure. Since the traditional industrial labor movement was so fragmented and undermined by the Volcker-Reagan assault of the 80s, where did the new movements focus their energy?
The struggle shifted. They moved away from disputes over industrial wages and focused instead on what the sources term accumulation by dispossession.
Accumulation by dispossession, what does that cover?
It covers the key mechanisms of contemporary neoliberalism: privatization of public assets, environmental degradation, and the systematic use of debt crises to seize assets. And because this dispossession entails the loss of fundamental rights, the right to land, to security, to subsistence, the common response was a turn to the universalistic rhetoric of human rights, dignity, and environmental rights.
But the final analysis brings us right back full circle to the core thesis, that this entire historical shift was, and still is, class warfare.
Absolutely. Many progressives perhaps focused on the fragmentation of industrial life. They dismissed class struggle as some kind of obsolete category. But the historical trajectory, defined by overwhelming, increasing upper-class power over the last few decades, that was class struggle writ large. A restoration of elite dominance that used economic policy as its primary weapon.
So the mass of the population has a choice.
They must either resign themselves to this overwhelming upper-class power or respond to it in class terms. And the first essential step is just naming this history correctly and unashamedly for what it is.
So the core finding from this deep stack of sources is pretty clear.
It is. Neoliberalization largely failed in its utopian aim of consistently revitalizing global capital accumulation. I mean, it led instead to chronic volatility and crisis management, but it succeeded remarkably well in its political objective.
It either restored class power to ruling elites, as we saw in the US and UK,
or it created the conditions for the rapid, controlled formation of a new capitalist class, as was demonstrated in China and post-Soviet Russia.
And with the media and political institutions so overwhelmingly dominated by upper-class interests and ideology, the myth could be relentlessly propagated.
The myth that states failed economically because they weren't competitive enough.
Which thereby created a manufactured continuous demand for more neoliberal reforms.
Right, justifying continued elite accumulation in the face of the very crises the system created.
The inherent political contradictions of the neoliberal state, coupled with the immense fiscal imbalances and that predatory financial system.
Particularly in the U.S.
It means we face a severe prospect of crisis. The dangerous fusion of economic precarity with extreme political nationalism is profoundly worrying. A major financial crash might be calculatedly used by elites to complete its agenda of total domestic domination.
So the question moving forward for you, the learner, is fundamentally political and it's philosophical.
Mhm.
When you look at the immense state power deployed to protect property rights in Iraq, or the financial integrity of Wall Street in 1975, or the political backing given to break labor,
You have to ask.
you have to ask. Political struggles over the proper conception of rights and even of freedom itself, they have to move center stage. What kind of freedom are we writing toward, and who benefits when we get there?
And here is a final provocative thought built on this history. Ruling classes rarely, if ever, voluntarily surrender any of their power or their privileges. This history confirms that they will actively fight a class war to restore them.
The only fear they have is of strong political movements that seriously threaten them with expropriation or with revolutionary political mobilization. Knowing this, what kind of strong and powerful social democratic or working class movement is in a better position to redeem capitalism, to force it back towards social compromise, stability, and broad prosperity than is capitalist class power itself? This knowledge should deeply inform how you approach every economic policy debate from this point forward.
A challenging and vital thought to end on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the historical, political, and ongoing class struggle that shaped the modern global economy. We hope you will take these insights and apply them actively to the world around you.